by washing them with mild soap and water. How is ice prevented from forming on the windshield of modern jet transport airplanes? The windshield has a heater element embedded in it. What are 2 ways rain can be kept from obstructing the pilot's vision through the windshield of an airplane? The rain can be blown away by a high-velocity blast of compressor bleed air, or it can be wiped away with electrically operated windshield wipers. When should rain repellent be used on an airplane windshield? Only when the windshield is wet with rain. Where can you find the instructions for adjusting the tension for the windshield wiper blade? In the aircraft maintenance manual. What is meant by a wet vacuum pump? A vacuum pump uses engine oil to lubricate its steel vanes. Let's move to Chapter 14, Cabin Atmosphere Control Systems. 85 terms. What controls pressurization system? The outflow valve. Is there any special requirement as to the type of oxygen used in an aircraft system, and if so, what is it? Only aviators breathing oxygen should be used. Describe the operating principle of a continuous flow oxygen system. High-pressure oxygen flow from the storage cylinder to a pressure regulator where its pressure is reduced and then to the mask outlets whenever the system is turned on. Describe the operating principle of a pressure demand oxygen system. Pressure demand systems provide oxygen to the mask at higher than atmospheric pressure when used at extremely high altitudes, forcing oxygen into the user's lungs. What should be used to purge an oxygen system of moisture? Oxygen, dry air, or dry nitrogen. What action must be taken when an oxygen system has been opened to the atmosphere? The system must be purged of any moisture. Describe the safety precautions that should be observed when servicing oxygen systems. Avoid all contact with petroleum-based oil or grease. Don't smoke. Keep everything very clean. Service systems outdoors if at all possible, and keep the caps on the bottles to protect the valves. What is a roots blower? A type of engine-driven compressor. Name 2 different types of independent cabin air compressor. Positive displacement and centrifugal. What is the source of pressurization air in most jet aircraft? Engine bleed air. What pressurization control unit will change the position of an outflow valve? The cabin pressure controller. Name several methods used on reciprocating engine aircraft for providing heated cabin air. Exhaust shroud heat exchangers, combustion heaters, and electric heaters. What is the function of the ventilating air in a combustion heater? It carries the heat to places where it is needed. What are the sources of ventilating air in a combustion heater? Ram air in flight, a blower on the ground, or possibly a compressor if the airplane is pressurized. Name the basic components of an air cycle cooling system. The compressor and expansion turbine, heat exchangers, and various valves. Describe the basic operating principles that allow an air cycle system to produce cool air. Hot engine bleed air is cooled in the primary heat exchanger, compressed, then cooled again in the secondary heat exchanger. This air is expanded across the turbine where energy is extracted and the pressure is reduced. This produces a large temperature drop. Describe the basic operating principles of a water separator. Cool, moist air is swirled so that water droplets are separately by centrifugal force captured by a sock and drained. Name the principal components of a vapor cycle system. A compressor, condenser, expansion, and an evaporator. In what significant way is a vapor cycle cooling system different from an air cycle system? Vapor cycle systems use a refrigerant liquid, usually Freon. Why is oil added to the refrigerant in a vapor cycle air conditioning system? To lubricate the compressor. Where does the warm air come from that is used to heat the cabin of most small single-engine reciprocating engine-powered aircraft? From a shroud around the engine muffler. What is the danger of a leak in an exhaust system cabin heater? Exhaust gases contain carbon monoxide, a colorless, odorless gas that can cause incapacitation or death to the aircraft occupants. How can an exhaust system be checked for leaks? Pressurize it with the discharge from a vacuum cleaner and wipe the outside of the system with a soap solution. How can you tell that there is carbon monoxide in the aircraft cabin? Indicator crystals in a CO detector will change color from a normally bright color to dark color. At lethal levels of CO they will turn black. Where does the fuel used in an aircraft combustion heater come from? From the aircraft fuel tanks. What happens to a combustion heater if the flow of ventilating air is restricted? If the ventilating air is restricted and the temperature reaches a preset value, the limit switch will cause the fuel to be shut off to the heater. What regulates the temperature in an aircraft cabin that is heated with a combustion heater? A thermostat senses the cabin temperature and cycles the fuel valve on or off to maintain the temperature at the desired value. What maintenance is required for a combustion heater? Clean the fuel filters and check for fuel leaks. What are two types of air conditioning systems that may be installed on an aircraft? Air cycle systems and vapor cycle systems. How is the heat removed from an aircraft cabin with a vapor cycle air conditioning systems? The cabin heat is absorbed by the refrigerant in the evaporator, then carried outside the aircraft where it is given up to the outside air in the condenser. What produces the cool air in a vapor cycle air conditioning system? Warm cabin air is blown across the evaporator where its heat is transferred into the refrigerant. What is used as a refrigerant in a vapor cycle air conditioning system? A Freon-type liquid refrigerant known as refrigerant 12 or the more environmentally friendly R134A. What is the state of the refrigerant as it leaves the compressor? It is a high-pressure gas. What is the state of the refrigerant as it leaves the condenser? It is a high-pressure liquid. What is the state of the refrigerant as it leaves the thermostatic expansion valve? It is a low-pressure liquid. What is the state of a refrigerant as it leaves the evaporator? It is a low-pressure vapor. How is the compressor lubricated? Refrigeration oil is mixed with the refrigerant and it circulates through the compressor and the entire system. What is the function of the thermostatic expansion valve? It meters just enough liquid refrigerant into the evaporator that all of it will be evaporated rated by the time it leaves the evaporator coils. How is refrigerant put into the system? It is put into the system through service valves on the low side of the system using a manifold gauge set. How should the components in the low side of a properly operating vapor cycle cooling system feel? They should feel cool. How is a vapor cycle cooling system checked for refrigerant leaks? Hold the probe of an electronic leak detector below any suspect fitting or component. If there is a leak, the tone of the sound produced by the detector will change. What safety equipment should be worn when charging a vapor cycle cooling system? A safety face shield that protects the entire face. Where does the warm air come from that is used to heat the cabin of a large jet transport aircraft? Warm engine compressor bleed air is used. Where is the first place the hot compressor bleed air gives up some of the heat in an air cycle cooling system? In the primary heat exchanger. What is the function of the air cycle machine in an air cycle cooling system? The centrifugal compressor increases the pressure and temperature of the bleed air. This high temperature air gives up some of its heat in the secondary heat exchanger and a great deal more as it drives the expansion turbine. Why must air cycle air conditioning systems incorporate a water separator? The rapid cooling of the air in the expansion turbine causes moisture to condense in the form of fog. How is the temperature of the air produced by an air cycle cooling system controlled? By a temperature control valve which mixes hot engine compressor bleed air with cold air from the expansion turbine. Why are cabins of most turbine-powered aircraft pressurized? These aircraft fly at such high altitudes that supplemental oxygen would be needed for the occupants if the cabins were not pressurized. Where does the pressurizing air come from on most smaller reciprocating engine-powered aircraft? From the engine turbocharger. What determines the amount of pressurization that an aircraft can use? The structural strength of the aircraft cabin. How is cabin pressure controlled in a pressurized aircraft? More pressure than is needed is pumped into the aircraft cabin and the pressure controller modulates the outflow valve to maintain the correct pressure in the cabin. What is meant by the isobaric mode of cabin pressurization? The isobaric mode of cabin pressurization is the mode that keeps the cabin altitude constant as the aircraft changes its flight altitude. What is meant by the constant differential mode of cabin pressurization? After the pressure in the aircraft cabin reaches the maximum value allowed by structural considerations, the constant differential mode of operation holds the pressure inside the cabin a constant amount above the outside air pressure. What is the function of the cabin outflow valve on a pressurized aircraft? It is to maintain the correct amount of pressure inside the cabin. What is the function of the cabin pressure safety valve on a pressurized aircraft? The cabin pressure safety valve prevents cabin pressure from exceeding the maximum allowable differential pressure. Why must pressurized aircraft have a negative pressure relief valve? The structure of an aircraft cabin is not designed to tolerate the inside pressure being lower than the outside pressure. What keeps the cabin of a pressurized aircraft from being pressurized when the aircraft is on the ground? A squat switch on the landing gear holds the safety valve open when the aircraft is on the ground. What are the two main gases that make up our atmosphere? Nitrogen and oxygen. What is used to check an oxygen system for leaks? A special leak detector liquid that is a form of non-oily soap. Why must fittings in an oxygen system not be tightened to stop a leak when there is pressure on the system? When the system is pressurized, the tubing is expanded slightly. If the fitting is tightened when it is expanded, it will likely leak when the pressure is reduced. What are 3 ways supplemental oxygen can be carried in an aircraft? As a high-pressure gas in its liquid form and as solid in the form of a chemical candle. What kind of gaseous oxygen must be used to service an aircraft oxygen system? Only aviators breathing oxygen. What is a continuous flow oxygen system? An oxygen system that continuously flows a metered amount of oxygen into the mask. What is a pressure demand oxygen system? An oxygen system that flows oxygen to the mask only when the wearer of the mask inhales. What identification must be stamped on an oxygen bottle carried in an aircraft? The identification DOT3AA or DOT3HT, the date of manufacture and the date of all of the hydrostatic tests. To what pressure and how often should DOT3AA oxygen cylinders be hydrostatically tested? They should be tested to 5/3 of their working pressure every 3 years. To what pressure and how often should DOT3HT oxygen cylinders be hydrostatically tested and when should they be retired from service? They should be tested to 3083 psi every 3 years and retired from service after 15 years. What kind of lubricant can be used for installing fittings in an oxygen system component? Teflon tape or a special water-based lubricant? What is used to check for leaks after replacing a fitting in an oxygen system? A special leak detector liquid that is a form of non-oily soap. What cleaning solutions can be used to clean parts used in an oxygen system? anhydrous ethyl alcohol, isopropyl alcohol, or freon. What may be used to dry components in an oxygen system after they have been cleaned? Water pump dry nitrogen. What may be used to purge the lines in an oxygen system after it has been opened for servicing? Water pump dry nitrogen. What must be done before any maintenance can be done on an oxygen system? The oxygen supply must be turned off at the bottle valve. Where does the pressurizing air come from the most turbine-powered aircraft? From air bled from one of the engine compressors. What are the 3 ways supplemental oxygen can be carried in an aircraft? As a high-pressure gas in its liquid form and as a solid in the form of a chemical candle. Chapter 15 Aircraft Fuel Systems. 57 terms. Why do some aircraft have fuel jettison systems? To allow the crew to reduce the weight of the aircraft down to or below the maximum allowable landing weight. Is there any reason why a fuel jettison system might be required on a small aircraft? Yes, if the maximum takeoff weight exceeds the maximum allowable landing weight, a jettison system would be required. What are some other names for a single-point fueling system? An underwing or pressure fueling system. Why do multi-engine airplanes have fuel crossfeed systems? To allow any engine to draw fuel from any tank. The fuel selector valve for a multi-engine aircraft must have at least 3 positions. What are they? On, off, and crossfeed. Why do some fuel tanks have internal baffles? To resist fuel surging or sloshing caused by changes in the altitude of the aircraft. What are the 2 types of fuel cells? Integral or wet wing fuel cells and bladder-type fuel cells. What does the term wet wing mean? It means that sealed portions of the aircraft wing structure form the fuel tank. How is the weight of the fuel supported when bladder-type fuel cells are used? The bladder is supported by the aircraft structure which contains it. Why do turbine aircraft have fuel temperature indicating systems? To allow the crew to determine if the fuel is cold enough to produce a danger of the formation of ice crystals. Name 4 types of fuel quantity gauging systems currently in use. Sight gauges, mechanical, electric, and electronic gauges. Why are electronic fuel quantity indicating systems more accurate than other types? They measure the mass of the fuel instead of the volume. What are drip gauges and sight gauges? Underwing, bayonet-type fuel gauges. What is the purpose of an in-transit light associated with an electrically operated fuel tank shutoff valve? To provide an indication that the valve is in motion between one position and another. For what reason is a fuel jettison system usually divided into 2 separate independent systems, one for each wing? To help maintain lateral stability by jettisoning fuel from a heavy wing if necessary. What procedures should be followed regarding gaskets and seals when replacing fuel system components? All old gaskets and seals should be replaced with new ones. Is it possible for a fuel system to develop a leak that has no visible evidence such as stain or spot, and if so, how? An internal component such as a valve could develop a leak. How is a fuel tank checked for leaks following a patch or welded repair? Pressurize the tank slightly up to 1/2 air pressure and then the repaired area must be checked for leak with a soap and water solution. Name some advantages of a single-point fueling system. It reduces fueling time, reduces chances for contamination and fire, and eliminates damage to aircraft skin. Why should you wait for a period of time after fueling an aircraft before checking the fuel sumps? To allow time for water and contaminants to settle to the drain point. What is used as a sensor in the fuel tank for an electronic type fuel quantity indicating system? tubular capacitors that extended across the fuel tank from top to bottom. What is the principle upon which the electronic type fuel quantity indicating system operates? Tubular capacitors extending across the fuel tanks change their capacitance as the fuel level changes. What is used as a sensor in the fuel tank for the older resistance type fuel quantity indicating system? A variable resistor with an arm that is moved by a float riding on top of the fuel in the tank. What is the purpose of a drip gauge in the fuel tank of a large aircraft? The drip gauge allows a mechanic to check the fuel level in a tank from the bottom of the tank. What markings must appear near the filler opening of the fuel tanks on reciprocating engine-powered aircraft and on a turbine-powered aircraft? On a reciprocating engine-powered aircraft, the word avgas and the minimum grade of fuel. On a turbine engine-powered aircraft, the words jet fuel, the permissible fuel designations, the maximum permissible fueling supply pressure, and the maximum permissible defueling pressure. Where can you find the correct part number for the fuel quantity sensor to be installed in an aircraft fuel tank? In the illustrated parts catalog for the aircraft. When must the fuel quantity indicating system indicate 0? During level flight when the fuel in the tank is equal to the unusable fuel supply. Where are fuel system strainers located? One strainer is located in the outlet to the tank and the main strainer is located in the fuel line between the outlet of the fuel tank and the inlet to the fuel metering device. Why do the fuel strainer used on some turbine engine aircraft have a warning device that signals the flight crew when this strainer is beginning to clog up? Strainers clog because ice forms on the filter element. The flight crew can route the fuel through a fuel heater to melt the ice. What must be done after a fuel system strainer has been cleaned or replaced? The system must be tested for leaks by pressurizing the system with the boost pump if one is used. Why is it important to drain all of the fuel sumps before the first flight of the day? Water can condense in the fuel tanks and it must be drained out before the aircraft is safe for flight. Is the procedure of draining the sumps with the aircraft in the ground attitude an assurance that all of the water is removed from the tanks? No, some aircraft require special procedures to remove all of the water. Refer to the aircraft flight manual or pilot's operating handbook. How does the water appear in the fuel drained from the tank sumps? Water appears as a clear globule of the container used to collect the fuel drained from the sumps. What color is grade 100 LL fuel? Blue. How can you detect jet fuel in the sample taken from the tank sump drains? Jet fuel is basically clear and it has an odor similar to kerosene. What must be done if the sump drain sample shows traces of jet fuel? The fuel system must be drained and flushed out with the proper grade of aviation gasoline. Why must an aircraft fuel valve have a detent in its operating mechanism? The detent gives the pilot a positive indication by feel when the selector valve is in the full on and full off position. What must be done before a fuel selector valve can be removed from an aircraft? The tank to which the valve is connected must be drained or otherwise isolated. What must be done after a fuel valve is replaced? The fuel system must be checked for leaks. How is a fuel leak indicated on a reciprocating engine-powered aircraft? The dye in the gasoline stains the area around the leak. What are the two reasons Prist is added to the fuel that is used in an turbojet aircraft? Prist is a biocidal agent that kills the scum-forming bacteria in the fuel tank and acts as an antifreeze agent, lowering the freezing point. What are the fuel tanks divided into compartments or have baffles installed in them? The compartments or baffles keep the fuel from surging back and forth as the aircraft changes its attitude in flight. What is meant by an integral fuel tank cell? A part of the structure in which all of the seams and joints are sealed so they will be fuel-tight. What are three uses of a centrifugal booster pump that is installed in an aircraft fuel tank? Booster pumps are used to produce fuel pressure for starting the engine, to keep the fuel from vapor locking at high altitude, and to transfer fuel from one tank to another. What is meant by a compensated engine-driven fuel pump? An engine-driven fuel pump whose pressure relief valve is acted upon by the pressure of the atmosphere. A compensated pump varies its outlet fuel pressure so it will stay a constant amount higher than the pressure of the air that is entering the carburetor. Why do engine-driven fuel pumps have a bypass valve in them? The bypass valve allows fuel from the booster pump to flow around the engine-driven pump mechanism for starting the engine with fuel if the engine-driven pump should fail. What characteristic of the fuel is measured with the mass flow fuel flow meter that is used with turbine engine aircraft? The density of the fuel. What is used as a flow meter for a fuel-injected, horizontally opposed aircraft engine? A pressure gauge that measures the pressure drop across the injector nozzles in the engine. What is meant by cross-feed system in an aircraft fuel system? A cross-feed system allows fuel from any tank to flow to any engine. Why do some aircraft have provisions for jettisoning fuel in flight? Aircraft that are certificated with a higher takeoff weight than their allowable landing weight must have provision for jettisoning fuel. What must be done to a welded fuel tank before it can be repaired by welding? All of the fuel vapors must be purged by flowing live steam through the tank by soaking it in boiling water. What safety precautions must be taken before a person enters the fuel cell of a large aircraft? The cell must be thoroughly purged of all fumes. The person entering the cell must wear proper safety equipment, and there must be a person standing by on the outside the cell. What is meant by single-point fueling system? A pressure fueling system in which the fuel is pumped into the aircraft through an underwing fueling port. What gas is used to purge a fuel tank of all fuel vapors? Carbon dioxide or nitrogen. Why do turbojet aircraft normally have fuel temperature indicators? Because of the low temperature at which these aircraft operate, it is possible for water to precipitate out of the fuel and freeze on the filters, shutting off fuel to the engines. What safety precautions should be taken before an aircraft is defueled? Be sure that the fuel truck is properly located. The truck and the aircraft are electrically grounded. What markings must appear near the filler opening of the fuel tanks on a reciprocating engine-powered aircraft and on a turbine-powered aircraft? On a reciprocating engine-powered aircraft, the word fuel and the minimum grade of fuel. On a turbine engine-powered aircraft, the word fuel, the permissible fuel designations, the maximum permissible fueling supply pressure. Now let's move to Chapter 16, Fire Protection Systems. 45. What is a continuous loop detection system? One or more wires embedded in a ceramic core resistance whose resistance changes with temperature change. Briefly describe the components of a thermal switch fire detection system. Temperature-sensitive switches that complete a circuit at a specific temperature and trigger a warning. Are thermal switches wired in series or in parallel with each other? Parallel. How are the detector units in a double-loop Fenwell system wired? In parallel between two complete loops of wiring. In what way is a thermocouple fire warning system different from a thermal switch system? Thermocouple systems are sensitive to the rate of temperature change, whereas thermal switch systems respond to a specific. Briefly describe the components of a CADE continuous loop fire detection system. A CADE system has an internal tube containing one or more wires embedded in a ceramic core whose resistance changes with temperature. Briefly describe the components and operation of a Lindbergh fire detection system. A stainless steel tube contains an inert gas and a discrete material that absorbs some of the gas. When the tube heats up, some gas is released, raising the pressure in the tube, which activates a pressure switch. Describe the process or mechanism by which a photoelectric smoke detector generates a warning of a possible fire. Smoke particles refract light in the detector unit, causing the photoelectric cell to conduct electricity and trigger the alarm. How can the operation of a photoelectric smoke detector be tested? By actuating a test switch. Name 2 types of smoke detection system used in aircraft. Light refraction types and ionization types. What are the usual locations where a carbon monoxide detector would be installed? In an aircraft cockpit or cabin. How does a carbon monoxide detector indicate the presence of this deadly gas? The tan spot on the detector turns gray or black. What are the possible effects of kinks and sharp bends in the sensing element of a fire warning system? False fire warnings caused by short circuits. How is a Freon container checked for proper pressure? A chart must be used to determine the maximum and minimum gauge pressure readings based on the ambient temperature. Name the 2 basic type of fire extinguishing systems. The conventional system and the high-rate discharge system. Name the extinguishing agent most commonly used by conventional fire extinguishing system. Carbon dioxide. Name the extinguishing agent most commonly used by high-rate discharge fire extinguishing systems. Halon, also known as Freon. How are Freon bottles protected from excessively high temperatures, and how can you tell that this has occurred? A thermal fuse will release the agent if the bottle temperature exceeds a certain limit. This blows out a red indicator disc. What condition is indicated if the yellow disc is missing in fire extinguishing system? The system has been discharged normally. Describe the mechanism by which a Freon bottle is discharged. An electrical signal fires an explosive squib which ruptures a frangible disc. How is the service life of a discharged cartridge calculated? From the date stamped on the cartridge by the manufacturer. What type of fire extinguishing agent is best for both cabin fires and engine fires? Halon 1301. What is a major disadvantage of CB fire extinguishing agent for extinguishing aircraft fires? It is a corrosive to aluminum and magnesium. Why is carbon tetrachloride not recommended as a fire extinguishing agent? Carbon tetrachloride produces phosgene, a deadly gas, when it is exposed to flames. How can you determine the state of charge of a CO2 fire extinguisher? By its weight. How can you determine the state of charge of a Freon fire extinguisher container? By the pressure shown on the built-in gauge. How does the ambient temperature affect the pressure shown on the pressure gauge on a Freon fire extinguisher? The higher the temperature, the higher the pressure. What releases the fire extinguishing agent in a high-rate discharge bottle? An electrically ignited powder charge blows a knife through a seal in the HRD bottle. What precaution must you observe when checking the electrical squib of an HRD fire extinguisher bottle for electrical continuity? It takes only a small amount of current to ignite the powder charge, and the method of testing must not send this amount of current through it. Does a thermocouple fire detection system warn the pilot of a general overheat condition? No, it operates on the rate of temperature rise and it detects only a fire. Does a thermal switch fire detection warn the pilot of a general overheat condition? No, it actuates only when there is a fire. How is a thermoswitch fire detector circuit checked? Close the test switch. If the system is continuous and not shorted, the fire warning light and bell will actuate. How is a continuous loop fire detector circuit checked? Close the test switch. If the system is continuous and not shorted, the fire warning light and bell will actuate. Does a pneumatic fire detection system warn the pilot of a general overheat condition? Yes, it actuates when there is a fire or general overheat condition. How is the pneumatic fire detection system tested? When the test switch is closed, low voltage AC flows through the stainless steel tube in which the gas-absorbing element is housed. This current heats the element, which releases gas and actuates the fire warning light and bell. What happens when the fire pulley handle is pulled in a jet transport aircraft? The bottle discharge switch is uncovered and armed. The generator field relay is tripped, fuel is shut off the engine, and hydraulic fluid is shut off to the pump. What must be done to release the fire extinguishing agent after the fire pulley handle has been pulled? The bottle discharge switch must be closed. What type of fire extinguisher is recommended for extinguishing a brake fire? A dry powder type extinguisher. How can you determine whether or not a built-in fire extinguishing system has been discharged? By checking the blowout plugs on the outside of the aircraft near the extinguisher agent bottles. What is indicated if the red disc in a built-in fire extinguishing system is blown out? The agent bottle has been discharged because of an overheat condition. What is indicated if the yellow disc in a built-in fire extinguishing system is blown out? The agent bottle has been discharged by the flight crew actuating the bottle discharge switch. What is used as a fire extinguishing agent in most of the high-rate discharge systems installed in an aircraft? One of the halogenated hydrocarbons such as halon 1301 pressurized with nitrogen. What three types of fire extinguishers are recommended for extinguishing cabin fires in an aircraft? Water, halon 1301, and carbon dioxide. How does carbon monoxide detector warn the occupant of an aircraft of an excess of carbon monoxide? The detector crystals in the indicator change color. What are two types of smoke detectors that are used in an aircraft? Photoelectric and visual smoke detectors. Where are smoke detectors normally located in an aircraft? Smoke detectors are located in baggage compartments in cargo areas. Last chapter of Airframe, Chapter 17, Aircraft Airworthiness Inspection. 37. Where do you find the regulation that specifies the operating conditions that make 100-hour inspections mandatory? FAR Part 91. A certificated airframe and powerplant mechanic may sign off and approve the return to service following what type of inspection? A 100-hour inspection. Under what conditions may a mechanic perform an annual inspection and return the aircraft to service? The mechanic must hold an inspection authorization. What is the time frame within which an annual inspection must be performed if such an inspection is required? Within the preceding 12 calendar months. Under what conditions may any checklist be used as a guide for a 100-hour inspection? The checklist must meet the minimum standards specified in FAR Part 43, Appendix D. May an aircraft that is overdue for an annual inspection be flown to a place where inspection can be performed? Yes, provided a ferry permit is obtained. In order for an individual person to conduct a 100-hour inspection and approve to return to service, that person must have what type of certificate? A mechanic's certificate with both the airframe and powerplant ratings. An aircraft is required by the FAR 91.409 to have a 100-hour inspection. Is it legal to fly that airplane beyond the inspection requirement, and if so, for how long? Yes, the aircraft may be operated for up to 10 hours if required to reach a place where the inspection can be accomplished. An airplane is flown 4 hours over the 100 hours inspection limit to reach your maintenance facility. How do you account for those 4 hours? The 4 hours are included in the next 100 hours time and service period. What type of operations require that aircraft operating under Part 91 must undergo 100-hour inspections? Aircraft operated for compensation or hire or used for flight instruction when provided by the flight instructor. An aircraft under a progressive inspection program is operated for compensation or hire. Does it need a 100-hour inspection? No progressive inspection replaces 100-hour inspections. Who is authorized to supervise a progressive inspection? Certificated A&P mechanics with an inspection authorization as well as a certified repair stations or the aircraft manufacturer. When a progressive inspection program is discontinued, at what time is the next 100-hour inspection due? 100 hours after the last complete inspection of the progressive program. An owner desires to use a progressive inspection program. To whom does the owner apply for authorization? To the FAA Flight Standards District Office having jurisdiction over the area where the owner is located. Is an engine run-up required as part of a 100-hour inspection on a turbine-powered aircraft? Yes. Where would you locate the required items that must be recorded in the aircraft maintenance records following completion of a 100-hour inspection? FAR Part 43. Where might you locate a sample of the recommended statement for return to service of an aircraft following completion of an annual or 100-hour inspection? FAR Part 43. Where would you look to find approved information for work on an aircraft electrical system? In the manufacturer's maintenance manual or other instructions for continued airworthiness. What are the limitations placed on mechanics with regard to propellers? Mechanics may not perform major repair to or alterations of propellers. After equipment is installed in accordance with an STC, who must approve the return to service? An A&P mechanic who holds an inspection authorization. What must the mechanic give the owner or operator of an aircraft if the aircraft he is giving a 100-hour inspection to proves to be unairworthy? A signed and dated list of all of the discrepancies that keep the aircraft from being airworthy. Where can you find the recommended statement to use for recording the approval or disapproval of an aircraft for return to service after 100-hour inspection? In 14 CFR 43.11. Under what conditions can an aircraft be operated with a 100-hour inspection overdue? The aircraft can be operated for no more than 10 hours after an inspection is due for the purpose of flying it to a place where the inspection can be performed. For how long can an aircraft be operated if a 100-hour inspection is overdue? For no more than 10 hours. The time beyond the 100 hours must be subtracted from the time before the next inspection is due. Under what conditions can an aircraft that is due an annual inspection be operated? It can only be flown when a special flight permit is issued. What determines whether or not an aircraft must be given a 100-hour inspection? Aircraft that carry persons for hire and aircraft that are used for flight instruction for hire must be given 100-hour inspections. What is the difference between an annual inspection and a 100-hour inspection? The inspections themselves are identical. An annual inspection can be conducted only by an A&P mechanic who holds an inspection authorization, while a 100-hour inspection can be performed by an A&P mechanic without an IA. What is a progressive inspection? An inspection of the same level as an annual inspection but approved by the FAA to be performed on a schedule that does not require the aircraft to be out of service for the time necessary to perform the entire inspection all at once. Does the FAA require that a checklist be used when conducting an annual or a 100-hour inspection? Yes, according to 14 CFR 43.15. What certification is required for a mechanic to conduct a progressive inspection? A mechanic certificate with an airframe and power plant ratings and an inspection authorization. Where can you find the requirements for inspecting the altimeter and static systems of aircraft operated under instrument flight rules? In 14 CFR Part 43, Appendix E. Where can you find the requirements for inspecting the ATC transponder that is installed in an aircraft? In 14 CFR Part 43, Appendix F. What items must be inspected on a helicopter in accordance with the instruction for continued airworthiness? The drive shafts or similar systems, the main rotor transmission gearbox, the main rotor and center section, the auxiliary rotor. Must all manufacturer's service letters, instructions, and bulletins be complied with on an annual or 100-hour inspection? Not unless they have been incorporated into an airworthiness directive. For how long must the record of a 100-hour inspection be retained in the aircraft maintenance records? For 1 year or until the next 100-hour inspection is completed. For how long must the record of the current status of life-limited parts of an engine be retained? This is part of the permanent records and it must be retained and transferred with the aircraft when it is sold. What certification is required for a mechanic to be able to approve an aircraft for return to service after 100-hour inspection? A mechanic certificate with airframe and power plant ratings. From what sources can you obtain the necessary information to work on electrical equipment? Information from the manufacturer's maintenance manual or instruction for continued airworthiness. Who is authorized for return to service radio equipment installations that were made in accordance with supplemental type certificate data? An A&P mechanic who holds an inspection authorization. Almost done. Almost done.